time for yet another sound check. Alright. Unclear what caused that particular start, but here we are. And I guess that means my entire intro was quite quiet, so welcome to another SixyTimes Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. With punishing that move with itself. But that's just Honoka for you. I would probably have put an achievement in the game for that, but it would be so hard to detect. Our earlier stream today was mostly about movement economy, making sure that you understand when to press buttons, when to go for holds, when to do nothing in particular. And this one is going primarily into combo theory, since without that, you won't necessarily be dealing the types of damage you want. The two things are approximately of equal importance when it comes to this game's damage as a whole, because hitting at the right time drastically increases your damage, whereas just pressuring your opponent until you pummel them tends to limit it, relatively speaking. Feel free to jump in this lounge. We have the second match open as well if you for some reason don't want to be on stream specifically. And we rotate around pretty quickly, particularly because this has a limit on number of consecutive matches you're allowed to win before you get pushed to the back anyway. Of course, in many cases, once you've won 3 matches, your best bet is to jump straight to match 2 and see if you get any matches there. Having better combo theory mostly controls where your opponent ends up on the screen at the end of your combo, and that is a decision you want to be able to make basically on demand. It's becoming more and more important in fighting games these days, as it is probably one of the skills that you can do without for a long enough time and not necessarily feel like you're missing out on a lot, while still providing some really nice complicated interactions for people to master as they get better at the game. This also applies to spacing after combos that your opponent blocks. But this game has an additional layer to its combo theory, things that aren't explicitly combos at all. Since your opponents can hold, assuming that they didn't get counter hit by the very first hit of a string, they can often hold the next hit in the string. And there's the break hold to basically guarantee it if they need it. Therefore, sometimes the flow of your attacks isn't so much a combo as it is a string that results in your opponent thinking they should hold when they shouldn't. Standardly, this sort of thing is called a frame trap, but in the sense where your opponent is specifically using a defensive option of this type, I'm not sure if people think of it the same way. It is still functionally the same thing you're doing, though. You want to get to the point where your opponent stops blocking because they think it's something they need to be able to do. Player had issues with actually being able to... Unclear. Hopefully they've resolved whatever it is. We discussed on a prior stream in which this player played Hayate that his combo theory is particularly important, as the ranges he often fights particularly well from aren't necessarily ranges where he gets a lot of good combo damage. So understanding exactly what combos you actually can get off the few moves that combo well is really important. And unfortunately, it's often true that the specific forms of predictability that he has mean that once you've learned to hold him, he really doesn't have a lot of options for going all out. He spends a lot more time explicitly going for tricks somewhere in the movement and just not being able to hit that hard. Fortunately, his normal hits do quite well here. Alright, so before this player had problems striking more so than moving, and it's not clear why, given that, you know, in the end, it's literally just hit buttons and hope something happens. But seeing nothing. Can you even unset all your buttons in this game? We'll give them a little time to work it out, sort of at least. But not too much, because in the end, you can't really do anything about it. If they have no buttons set, it's just going to be nothing. And it doesn't look like they're specifically trying anymore either. There we go. Alright then, the beginning of the sibling battle. I played this game series for a long time. Historically, this matchup has been easier on Hayate than on Kasumi, but this is generally because Hayate hasn't been the same character. The one you know as Ain was generally the one you got. The main reason for this is that Kasumi keeps up with Hayate specifically quite well in footsies, but tends to stun and strike in ways that tend to lead to better combos. And more misleading things. Whereas Hayate tends to be easier to whiff punish, and his little sister is just faster. So whereas he often has the advantage of being both tricky and a confusion in range, both as a player and as a character, Kasumi cares less about this than many others. Another problem he often has is relatively slow startup on some of the things that he would use as his better defenses against her movement. And finally, she tends to go through a lot of the stuff he does, which doesn't help at all. Your best bet is usually to try to sidestep her positions and then get your hits from there, as a lot of her better attacks for this matchup don't actually do a lot of sweeping around to catch you for sidestepping. You normally will get away with it because she just tends to do straightforward attacks. And while he doesn't really have those great sidestep into attack things that many other characters do, it does help enough, particularly because he can get closer and therefore use faster moves, instead of having to figure out how to beat her normals from relatively further away. Bayman, on the other hand, could do the same things, but the problem is that we're sort of the opposite way. Bayman's attacks on Kasumi tend to be straightforward, so she gets to sidestep a bit more often. But she also lacks the sort of sidestep coolness that characters like Tina and Ayane have, so you have to be a lot more careful about when you do this. Your goal is generally, in fact, to basically try to become plus. Because once you have reached the point where you are plus frames against Bayman, you have a lot more you can do that the other opponent can't necessarily deal with. He's not terribly limited in range, but he's limited just enough that he has to be careful in more situations than you might want to have to do it normally. In fact, this tends to mean that he's a little bit predictable about whether or not you are going to be hit by a kick or a punch, which makes your life easier on Kasumi's side often enough that you get more throws and don't have to worry as much. One simple way to think of it is that she's overall an unsettling character to Bayman. And in fact, can generally just be even more specific in her attack strings than you would expect even normally. Because he is strong, but linear enough that you can think through his attacks. Hitomi, on the other hand, has a very comprehensive style. She can strike in nearly any way and isn't linear enough that you could spend most of your time thinking this spacing means the next thing that's happening is this thing. Nor can you necessarily weave through her attacks all that well. Often, you need to minimize the damage she does instead. Becoming plus won't necessarily help. You have to think a lot more about the player's perspective. You have to get into your opponent's head a lot more rather than just managing to measure spaces and whatever else. But of course, this isn't necessarily a terribly difficult thing for a Kasumi player to do because that's the character in a nutshell a lot of the time. It's in Hitomi's best interest to fight from fairly far away because it gives her better chances of reacting to stuff Kasumi wants to do. But this has its own downsides because Kasumi doesn't fear Hitomi at long ranges basically at all. Even that sort of hot move, she tends to duck her way out of the actual inputs fast enough that you don't care. And because of the way the damage is done, or rather not well done, the situation doesn't improve from the Hitomi side very easily. Once you are close together, you do still have to manage to make the read. And that probably is the biggest thing you're normally facing here. As you can see, if my opponent stays far enough away, lags help a little bit, but still not overall a problem. But you all seen this happen enough in other games. My opponent backs off because it's the main way to get any advantage. Fortunately, it wasn't really going to be much help if I won that anyway, so we get to the demonstration of a character that doesn't really care if you back off, will just kind of leave you there. And a player who has been working on precisely that perspective. While Honoka doesn't necessarily have particularly great attack strings or attack situations that will overwhelm an opponent that is backing off, she also has a different type of defense than Kasumi does. Kasumi tends to trade when she's doing things if the opponent is actually striking and not just approaching, whereas Honoka often wins in that scenario. She also whiff punishes somewhat better. In general, when you face an opponent in this game that is mostly just backing off, your combo theory becomes even more important, because they're not going to give you a lot of chances to choose the way you want to engage them. And a lot of the time, learning the combos that will not put your opponent further away becomes even more important, because you explicitly need to not lose your close range attack options. There is some lag here which might actually be affecting it, but I'm not sure. For me it was fairly bad in terms of where it made the connections of problems. But for Omni it's harder to say because, again, Honoka doesn't care as much about this as a generality, that is. But it would help if you can't necessarily target. So in a way, playing from the longer range is more helpful if you realize that the situation is laggy from the Hitomi side. Honoka doesn't benefit as much from the lag in general if the opponent is continually moving away. You can get some good setups in terms of throws, but they're usually not that damaging nor particularly rewarding as a core idea. Overall though, if you want to play very defensively, the thing you normally need to increase in all games, particularly this one because of the way the combo theory works, is that you must increase your accuracy. You have to know that when you've decided to go for a strike to set up a combo or something, that you're not just hitting buttons that will end up putting you in your opponent's space without necessarily actually striking, or at least putting them in a block situation. And this can't necessarily be solved, as just demonstrated, by using moves that spend more time or push you further forward. Those are not in themselves solutions, because the higher you get with higher player skills, the less you will find that they actually fall for these moves. But from Honoka's side, this is still hard and still a good way to go about it for Hitomi, simply because Honoka takes too long to do massive damage from the sorts of stray hits she gets unless you are really, really inaccurate with your Hitomi movement. Being intimidating in any way tends to help out quite a lot. But with that intimidation skill must come the capacity to actually recognize when your opponent is stressed and is likely to give you an opportunity to whiff punish something. Here's a matchup that gets rough very fast because without understanding why it is that Lei Fan can stop Hayate, you don't really have a lot of incentive to hit any buttons. But the moment he hits even one, you can basically no longer stop him. She does have moves, though, that cover space in such a way that makes them hard to whiff punish. I don't remember if it's her forward H plus K or back H plus K, but she has functional stomps that will take him out of his approach vector really quickly. Hayate's best bet is in fact to not go for those big attacks that then try to get around her normals, because she just has one normal that basically shuts down all of them. What he often wants is to get closer, or to convince her that it's not a good idea to press them because he's going to punch her out of it instead, or do the same getting closer thing. And then, of course, he can go right back to using his various tricks. You must convince your opponent that you don't intend to do the main thing. As with most games and their first order strategies, the next stage beyond the first order strategy that was working, that your opponent is now countering, is to convince them, I'm not going to use that anymore, don't worry about it, until you do. This is balanced out from Hayate's side by the fact that for the most part, Lei Fang's offense against Hayate isn't great, and what is there tends to be relatively obvious. It's either a high kick to your head or a mid kick. And while these two things are seemingly similar, they're a little bit difficult to hold both of them. So at least she has some options, but they don't lead to big damage, so you have to be really on point with your understanding of your opponent's flow before you can get much out of it. Both players in this matchup need to understand one thing above all else. Once combination attacks have ended, once you've hit your first two buttons or whatever, you don't want your opponent far away from you. The thing you want to do is immediately throw. No, almost all of the time. Even if you get teched in the throw, it is still better than actually kicking your opponent away. Because resetting to neutral in this matchup is almost going back to coin flip scenarios. And if you were on offense and doing well, you have no reason to do this. This is also why it's such a good idea to get your opponent as close to the wall as possible, as quickly as possible, so that you don't have to worry about it anymore at all. In a similar scenario, if you've knocked your opponent down in particular ways, you don't really get anything out of the opposite. Once you've realized I've slipped, I've knocked them down in the corner, move back, because if you do land another hit, at least it will be somewhat payoff. I'm surprised the damage on this is as good as it is right now. It's usually quite bad. This move is a high, by the way. And I believe you can just hold it, but I don't remember for sure because I think normally the problem is that you're trying to get out of a string more so than the other problem. But is it holdable? I've literally never thought to check. Of course, the other point is that it's a high so you can just crouch and it will never hit you. Having crouching moves, or moves that move you through a crouching stance as you strike, is obviously a better option because then you will simply get more damage. But these might start up in specific ways. But if your character has anything good off their, for example, 3P, you certainly don't have to worry so much about most characters approaching you with their special attack. At that point though, of course, there is still spacing to be concerned about. So if you ever run into this, the first order strategy is non-obvious, especially if you've been playing this game for too long and have all these other things going around in your mind. But it is important to remember that sometimes you will just meet that opponent who either only knows to do one thing or has no interest in doing a second thing until you prove that you can beat the first thing. Damon thankfully has a lot of relatively long range crouching normals, and therefore could probably defend himself in this situation a lot better. Unfortunately, it looks like our Bayman got a little caught up in trying to counter the move instead of trying to counter the person. And that's something you have to get used to in this game quite a lot. It's a little bit difficult when you first start, because when you're trying to counter moves, you're thinking about what the purpose of those moves are. But the opponent is not necessarily using the move for the purpose of the move. They're using the move because they think it will stop you from doing something. And that is really important to make a distinction of. What is it that your opponent doesn't want you to do that makes them keep doing this move? That's the only thing you care about. Because the sort of person who does this is, regardless of whether or not they do it for the first reason or the second reason, chances are they're afraid of something. I mean, some people are just quote-unquote jerks about it, but even then, usually there's some underlying, I'm afraid of you doing X, but you haven't shown me that you're able to get it done if I keep doing this. And therefore, the problem is resolved. They just keep on hitting the thing, and eventually it works, and you're not able to do the thing that they are afraid of. But identifying that thing that they're afraid of you doing is probably the most important part of it. Simply because it's literally a shortcut to whatever it is that you should actually be able to use to beat them. Ooh, I've not seen that combo in a while. This move is also fairly whiff punishable, and the punches being used at basically the same ranges are equally so. So you don't necessarily have to worry as much. That was a choice. That was a choice and a half. I'm not sure if he actually didn't get out of the way in time. But that does happen sometimes, and you do have to be careful about it, particularly in laggy matches. There you see a demonstration of it. If your opponent is afraid of you hitting them in certain scenarios, you should generally assume that whatever strategy they've come up with, whatever button it is that you are seeing them hit, it does in fact beat that main thing that they're afraid of. If it didn't beat it at least some of the time, they would have found a different thing to do. And that is very important when you're thinking through strategies in these games. If the moment your opponent starts doing something is because they wanted you to stop doing something that was beating them, it is not often true that you could just do that thing better. Because they have refined their style through hitting all sorts of different things until they managed to find one that stopped whatever it was they were afraid of. I was choosing stage. Alright, we've discussed this one already on the stream for the day. I need to get me my plus frames, but my opponent is probably adapting in a way that is really helpful and requires higher accuracy from me. I always forget that that doesn't work that way. And there you see the reason. Bayman's movement against her is so good, and the amount of frames he gets out of being plus, because that's the strength of the character as a whole, he can get to good positions and be advantaged if he gets there. Therefore, you have to care a lot more about not letting him get to them. The long reach also helps catch moves that you're trying to do from relatively far startup positions. And the sidestep to the win. We're now closing in on the end of our stream, and many of us have already played quite a bit of this game today, so it's not exactly sure when the lounge will close. But I don't think this is necessarily the last on-stream match of the night. Probably more so second last. Huh, does that not work? How did they even get in here? We'll be hard at work, possibly a little bit tonight and beyond, working on getting our King of Fighters bot ready for release tomorrow. So if you're interested in that game and need practice with offense, you can look out for that around 7:30 Eastern time or somewhere within the hour after that, alongside our DNF Duel Battle Lounge content. It's unclear whether or not we will be running both the EU and the NA lounges for Do Not Falter, but you can usually expect to see something, even if it's just team members around at about the same time playing the game in question. Something broken again? There we go. Not quite as broken as when we started. This game's music is so good at being fighting game music while still not specifically trying to get in your face all the time. The range on that kick though. But such is the nature of Hayate, it's what makes the character so effective in many situations. Gotta respect the man's flexibility. Information on whether or not we have released the bot at the time intended, as well as if there's any reason we may not be streaming. Although rather, most of the time if we're not streaming, what happens is that you don't get a tweet announcing the stream at the time you'd expect. If you don't see it about 15 minutes after stream time, assume that no stream is happening. That doesn't necessarily mean no lounge is happening, so you might still want to look around, but if you don't find any of that either, tweet is a good backup in terms of understanding that nothing is going to pop up. It's also similarly helpful when the stream is going to be late, and we will actually tell you the stream is going to be late, and that's often done at the correct time, so you'll know to look around anyway. Bots in general can be found at our website 2-mk.org, and the Twitter handle in question is 2_mk_FGC. But that kick brings us to the end of our stream for tonight. The lounge will stay open for a while longer if you want to join in and fight. This has been Rillian, 142MK. Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.